Sonya.
Okay, well, I don't know the last time that you have read or heard anything from the book of Numbers. It's not usually a book of the Bible that we tend to really go to for how do we live, or it's not really an enjoyable book, let's be honest. And so I probably have chosen the worst chapter out of all the lectionary readings to focus on, and that is what we read here in chapter 11 of Numbers. Now, I want to also just have a little disclaimer to start with, that I have some very real issues with how God is portrayed in this passage, particularly the way that he gets angry and what seemingly seems to be violent. And it's something that we see throughout the Old Testament. We see Israel's rejection of God and a covenant that he made with them that results in severe judgment, whether that's like fireballs from heaven or holes in the ground swallowing up people, or plagues while they're eating a bunch of quail. But I want to say that that theme is really beyond the scope of anything I can cover today. And it's honestly a theme that I haven't got figured out yet. I don't fully understand it. I don't get it. And it's a troubling thing for me to read about God being sort of so inflamed with anger that his nostrils flare out and boom, off goes the judgment. But here is what I do know, which I hope will give us a little bit of context to this passage that we read. And so God made a covenant with old Father Abraham way back when. And this covenant was a promise that God would give Abraham's descendants a land. He would make them a nation, and he would bless them so that they would be a blessing. And that's really how a lot of Genesis explains to us. And so we will spring forward a few hundred years, and these descendants of Abraham have become a nation called Israel. They are in Egypt, being extremely fruitful and multiplying when a new king of Egypt comes to power. So they had been having a lot of favor. They had been welcomed into Egypt, and they had kind of settled there. But now this new king, he doesn't really like what he sees, and he starts to enslave the Israelites. Some years pass, and a new Pharaoh is in power, and things are just getting worse. The Israelites cry out to God, and God sends these plagues on Egypt that ultimately cause Pharaoh to finally let them go. And so Israel leaves Egypt. They miraculously pass through the Red Sea, and they end up at Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, God, via Moses, gives the nation the 10 commandments and another bunch of instructions, including how to build a tent good enough to hold God's presence. Now, this tent was called the tabernacle, or the tent of meeting. And once it was built, it was filled with God's glory. The symbol of his presence, of God's presence, was visible. It was a cloud during the day and a fire by night. Now we reach the book of Numbers. Of course, this is a very, very abridged version. Okay, so we reach the book of Numbers, and it starts with the Israelites camping at Mount Sinai. It's their second year in the wilderness, and it's time for their journey to begin, their journey to the land of Canaan, which God has promised them. So in wonderful Old Testament, prosaic, matter-of-fact detail, we read about these preparations. And these preparations are, let's take a census of all the men over the age of 20, basically all those who would be fit for war. And second, the Israelites are instructed how to organize themselves around the tent of meeting. And the way that they get organized is that the 12 tribes of Israel are each situated to the north, the south, the east, and the west. So 3 tribes at the north, 3 tribes at the east, 3 tribes at the south, and 3 tribes at the west. And right in the middle, surrounding the tent of meeting, are the Levites, the ones who are going to be the priests who will minister in that tent of meeting. And so once this camp is organized, there were 12 days devoted to the dedication of the altar. So that is 12 tribes, 12 offerings, 12 days. Now, until this point, things have been going really well. Israel has been saved through an awesome exodus where God literally passed through their midst. He went before them, he split the Red Sea, and he safely took them to Mount Sinai. The memory is fresh. There's still the buzz of excitement, and every day God is providing them with food and water in the desert. 24 times in the 10 chapters preceding our passage, we are told the Israelites did according to the commandment of the Lord through Moses, or some variation of that. God commands and the people obey. Put your tent here. Okay, we'll do that. And that's how it goes on for 10 chapters. In fact, they are so good that in the midst of all this monotonous detail, we hear of God blessing the people through a benediction. And you will probably recognize this benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Wonderful stuff. God is present, God is active, and the people of Israel are obeying. And then we reach Numbers 11, and it's basically all downhill from here. Just 3 days into their travel from Mount Sinai, the people begin to complain. After all that has just happened with the visible presence of God, there is bitter groaning. In many ways, it should leave us going, what the heck just happened? They were doing so well, but now, what's going on? Sorry, don't understand. But what we get at the beginning of Numbers is a generic complaint. It doesn't reveal too much other than it has something to do with them groaning over their misfortunes. But this one little paragraph introduces us to the main theme of rebellion and complaining that we see repeated in the next 14 chapters and beyond. In fact, it gets so bad from this point onwards that a 2-week journey turns into a 40-year wilderness wandering, where the current generation that has seen the glories of God, that has been saved from the harsh slavery of Egypt, they never actually get to see this promised land. And though we call this book Numbers, the Hebrew title is Bimidbar, which I am probably totally getting it pronounced wrong, Bimidbar. But its translation is in the wilderness, which in my opinion is a much better title, because the book is not really about numbers. It's not really about the census. Rather, it focuses on that time in the wilderness, that time after all the impressiveness of the Exodus where God saves Israel, but before the conquest of Canaan, where the people to receive the glories of the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey. God has come down, salvation has been accomplished, but the future glories are not yet. They are living in this life after that often happens in the wilderness. And so in this passage, we kind of read about 2 gatherings. The first is a gathering of the rabble, this riffraff that are gathering in selfish complaint. They're sort of craving, their bodily appetites are taking over, and they're just like, oh, give us meat, we want meat. And then we have Moses and a bunch of elders who are gathering together in solidarity to share in the spirit and to carry each other's burdens. So this riffraff that is craving more than what has been provided. The manna is getting a bit boring, it's bland, and the rabble starts to influence the rest of the Israelites. And if you recognize my title, you might know that there is a whole song by Keith Green on this. So you want to go back to Egypt. And he talks about how they're complaining and they're groaning and they're like, oh, we've had manna hotcakes, we've had manna waffles, we've had manna burgers. We fried it, we baked it, we boiled it. We've even made banana bread. But these people, they're getting hangry for something more. The desert is playing tricks on the mind, and they're beginning to reimagine those wonderful days of old when they were enslaved in Egypt, sipping cucumber water by the Nile, boiling melons, eating meaty fish with leeks and onions and garlic. Mwah. But I don't know, they've got a little bit of a selective memory here. They seem to forget about Pharaoh drowning babies, or the forced labor with the ruthless taskmasters that made their life unbearable. And as their complaining grows, life in Egypt seems to sound more like wonderful high tea at the Empress in Victoria. But complaining over food is nothing new in the story of Israel. When Israel first came out of Egypt, the people asked for food and water, and God happily gave it to them. But his provision at that point was before any of the miracle manna, the angel bread, appeared, or before the law was given. It was before the Israelites had set up the tabernacle and witnessed the daily presence of God within their midst. So now in the wilderness, they reject all that God has done, all that he has provided, and all that he has promised. They have lost their perspective and they are craving Egypt. This complaining is actually so bad that it causes Moses to lose his perspective, that he almost becomes suicidal. Why have you done this to me? If this is the way you are going to treat me, just let me die now. He can't seem to see a way forward. And so while the riffraff and the Israelites wail at their tents for meat, God gathers 70 appointed elders in the tabernacle. God comes down in the cloud, and they have a little prophetic party when God puts some of his spirit on them. However, there are two individuals for who, whatever reason, stayed in the camp. But even so, the spirit falls on them, and they also prophesy. God's power and spirit is not just in that tent of meeting, but it is truly in the midst of the people in the camp. And as the elders return to that camp after that meeting, along comes the quail. So much quail that it would take a whole day to walk through it. But once again, the people forget that when the manna or the quail came, they were only to collect enough to meet their need for that day. God was still going to provide every single day, but they forgot about that. And in effect, God just gives them what they asked for. They wanted quail, they wanted meat, they wanted Egypt. And so they got it. They got quail, they got meat. In fact, they got Egypt because what happens is God sends a plague to them all. So what does any of this actually mean for us? It's a strange story. It has a lot in it that I can't even get to grips with or cover. But someone in the New Testament, a guy called Paul, basically said these things happened to them to serve as an example to us, to instruct us. You can find that in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 to 12. So if it serves as a warning to us to essentially mind how we go, what does that actually mean? That doesn't help me, to be honest. Okay, is it talking about complaining? Do I have to watch my tongue? Some people have taken this passage and other passages and Numbers and have basically said that we are not to complain. But the biblical witness is totally opposite to that. We have Psalms of lament that encourage us to pour out our struggles and our complaints to God, and that he will listen to them. So if that's the case, what on earth is going on here? There is something more. And I think it is that essence that they were rejecting what God had given and provided to them, and were wanting to go back to how things were before they were saved. And for us, I think, as we are on this open way journey, we are traveling along on our own wilderness path. We've left Egypt behind, but things are tough. We've got sand down our pants and we've got dust in our eyes. And perhaps we're feeling a little bit disorientated. The excitement of past events have faded away, and we're not really sure what God is even doing, or if he even cares. All we see is this crappy manna we have to eat all day. So if Numbers 11 serves as a warning of what not to do, what does that mean that we should do because we're not told? If anything, I think our current circumstances with the pandemic are a sort of wilderness for many of us. We found ourselves struggling and living in a different kind of wilderness. We've watched, maybe participated in hoarding toilet paper. Perhaps we've craved comfort in things that we once left behind in our past. We are dismayed and discouraged by the prevalence of misinformation and disinformation. We've heard the ongoing complaints of the few who wish to resist public health measures. The wilderness is a weary place. And in the wilderness, it's really hard to maintain practices and rituals that support healthy attitudes. It's easy to look at the past, what was before, and think, you know what, we would be a lot better off back there before any of this happened. What hope is there for the future? And just like Israel forgot what God had done, so too can we. We can forget the privilege of freedom we actually experience. Like Israel, we've been set free, and we must now choose which direction we want to go, back to Egypt or on to the promised land. I think what is important in this passage is that we are clearly shown that whatever journey we are taking, we are not alone. And for us, though we have this choice about which way we want to go, there are things that we can do to bring alive the memory of what God has done for us. There are ways in which we can support each other to carry the burdens that we see and feel and experience as on our daily lives. As the people had manna in the desert, the daily reminder that God is providing for us, we have a different kind of manna. We have a manna that gave up its life for us on the cross. It is a manna that we eat and drink in communion as a reminder of what God has done for us. In many ways, when we gather together as a community, when we gather together and take communion, we are, in essence, taking part in a physical reminder of God's salvation and presence with us. It is a communal act that each one of us are not alone on this journey, that we belong here together in community. And so, as I conclude this sermon, I want to just remind us that we are not alone, that though things are tough in the wilderness, we have a community that we belong to. And we have practices and rituals that we can partake in that will help us to remember and to encourage and support us on this journey. Amen.